The alarm bells rang through the metal halls of Nexus Prime at exactly 6 in the morning. Jake Morrison rolled out of his narrow bed and stood up straight. Around him, other cadets from different worlds were doing the same thing. His roommate was a tall blue alien called Crix, who had 3 eyes and skin that looked like smooth stone. Crix moved slowly in the mornings, but Jake had learned not to rush him. Jake pulled on his gray uniform and checked his appearance in the small mirror. On the wall, he was 22 years old and had been at this military school for 3 years now. His brown hair was cut short like all the other cadets, and his green eyes looked back at him with the same determination he felt every morning. Today would be another day of proving that humans belonged here among the stars. The dining hall was huge and filled with noise. Hundreds of cadets from dozens of different worlds sat at long tables eating breakfast. Jake could see the tall, thin ethereals with their silver skin sitting at one table. At another table, the rock-like granite people ate their mineral supplements. The flying wind catchers hung from special perches near the ceiling, their wing arms folded as they fed. Jake got his food from the serving line. Human food was simple compared to what some of the other species ate. He sat down at a table with other humans and a few aliens who had become his friends over the years. There was Lisa from Earth's European sector, who was the best pilot in their class. Next to her sat Zan, a friendly Aquarian whose blue skin had patterns that changed color with his mood. "Big day today," Lisa said as she ate her protein bar. "Combat simulation with the advanced class." Jake nodded. The combat simulations were the hardest part of their training. They had to work as teams with aliens who thought differently, moved differently, and had completely different ideas about how to fight. Some species liked to charge straight at the enemy. Others preferred to hide and strike from shadows. Humans usually tried to find a middle path that used everyone's strengths. "General Vextar will be watching," Zan said, his skin patterns turning orange with worry. "I heard he does not like humans very much." Jake had heard the same thing. "General, Vextar was from a world called Zephyr, where the people looked like giant insects with 4 arms and hard shells covering their bodies. The Zephyrians had been fighting wars across the galaxy for thousands of years. They were known for being tough, disciplined, and not very patient with species they thought were weak." "We will do fine," Jake said calmly. "We always do." After breakfast, the cadets went to their morning classes. Jake sat in military history and learned about battles that happened on worlds he had never seen. He studied the tactics of generals from species that had been extinct for centuries. The teacher was an old ethereal named Professor Shin, whose silver skin had turned almost white with age. "Today we will discuss the Battle of Corton 9, Professor Shin said in his thin, musical voice. "Can anyone tell me why the Hive Fleet was defeated despite having more ships?" Several cadets raised their hands. Jake raised his as well, but the professor called on a Zephyrian cadet named Vexka. She was related to General Vextar and had the same hard shell and 4 arms. "The enemy was weak," Vexka said firmly. "They did not press their attack when they had the advantage. Weakness in battle always leads to defeat." Professor Shin nodded slowly. "That is one way to look at it. Jake, what is your opinion?" Jake stood up as was required when answering questions. "I think the Hive Fleet lost because they did not adapt to changing conditions. They had a good plan, but when the defenders used unexpected tactics, the Hive Fleet could not change their approach fast enough. Flexibility won the battle, not just strength." Vexka made a clicking sound with her mouthparts, which Jake knew was a sign of disagreement among Zephyrians. Several other alien cadets looked interested in his answer, but some of the warrior species looked annoyed. "Flexibility," Vexka said loudly, "is just another word for not having the courage to stick to your plans." "Sometimes," Jake replied calmly, "the best plan is to be ready to change your plan." Professor Shin raised one thin hand to stop the discussion. "Both viewpoints have merit. We will continue this debate in your next assignment." After classes, the cadets went to the simulation center. This was a huge building with rooms that could create any kind of battlefield using advanced technology. The walls, floors, and ceiling could become anything from a jungle planet to the inside of a space station under attack. Jake's squad was made up of 12 cadets from 8 different species. Besides Jake and Lisa, there was Crix, his roommate, two granite people named Rock and Stone, a windcatcher called Breeze, an Aquarian named Flo, and several others. They had trained together for months and knew each other's abilities well. The simulation room changed into a city under attack. Buildings stretched up toward a gray sky, and the sound of explosions came from somewhere in the distance. Their mission was to rescue civilians trapped in the center of the city, while enemy forces tried to stop them. "Standard approach," said Vexka, who was leading another squad. "Direct assault, maximum force, quick victory." Jake looked at the mission briefing on his small computer screen. "We need to think about the civilians. If we fight too hard in the city center, innocent people might get hurt." "Innocent people get hurt in wars," Vexka replied. "That is the price of victory." "Maybe," Jake said, "but our job is to save lives, not just win battles." The simulation began. Vexka's squad charged straight toward the city center, their weapons firing as they advanced. Enemy forces met them with heavy resistance, and the battle became intense very quickly. Buildings started to collapse from the weapons fire. Jake led his squad on a different path. Instead of fighting through the main streets, they moved through side alleys and underground passages. When they encountered enemies, Jake had his squad use non-lethal tactics when possible. Crix used his natural strength to block passages, forcing enemies to find other routes instead of fighting. The windcatcher Breeze flew overhead and dropped small devices that confused the enemy's sensors. It took longer than Vexka's direct approach, but Jake's squad reached the civilians without causing major damage to the city. They evacuated the trapped people through the same hidden routes they had used to get in. When enemy reinforcements arrived, Jake's squad was already gone. The simulation ended with both squads completing their mission, but Jake's team had saved more civilians and caused less destruction to the city. The computer gave them a higher score for efficiency and tactical thinking. General Vextar had been watching from the observation deck above the simulation room. Jake could see the general's 4 eyes staring down at them through the thick glass. The general's expression was hard to read, but Jake got the feeling that Vextar was not pleased. As the cadets filed out of the simulation room, Jake heard Vexka talking to her squad members. "Humans always choose the slow way," she said in her clicking voice. "In a real battle, the enemy would have killed the civilians while they were sneaking around." Jake did not respond to her criticism. He had learned that arguing with Zephyrians rarely changed their minds. They respected strength and directness above all else, and they saw human tactics as signs of weakness rather than intelligence. That evening, Jake sat in his room reading reports from the simulation. His squad had performed well, but he knew that some of the instructors thought his methods were too cautious. In the 3 years he had been at the academy, he had heard the same criticism many times. Humans were too soft, too concerned with avoiding casualties, too willing to compromise instead of dominating their enemies. Jake closed his computer and looked out the window at the stars beyond the space station. Somewhere out there was Earth, the world where he had grown up learning that strength came in many forms. His grandfather had been a soldier who fought against other humans in the last great war on Earth. Before he died, the old man had told Jake something that stayed with him every day. "The strongest person," his grandfather had said, "is not the one who can hurt others the most. The strongest person is the one who can stop themselves from hurting others when they have every reason to do so." Jake had not understood those words completely when he was young. Now, after 3 years of training alongside species that valued conquest over cooperation, he was beginning to see what his grandfather meant. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that humans belonged among the stars. But tonight, Jake Morrison went to sleep knowing that he would face those challenges the same way he always had, with intelligence, determination, and the kind of strength that came from choosing the harder path because it was the right path. The next morning started like any other day at Nexus Prime. Jake woke up early, ate breakfast with his friends, and attended his classes. But something felt different in the air. Other cadets whispered in the hallways, and the instructors seemed more serious than usual. Even Crix, who was usually calm about everything, kept changing colors more often than normal. During lunch, Lisa leaned over to Jake and spoke quietly. I heard General Vextar wants to see you after afternoon training. See? Me? Why? Jake asked, though he had a feeling he already knew the answer. Someone said he was not happy about yesterday's simulation, Lisa replied. Vexka has been telling everyone that human tactics are dangerous and weak. Jake nodded and continued eating his food, but his mind was racing. He had known this day would come eventually. For 3 years, he had watched other species judge humans based on incomplete information. They saw human kindness as weakness, human careful planning as fear, and human concern for others as a lack of warrior spirit. The afternoon training session was in hand-to-hand combat. Jake paired with different aliens to practice fighting techniques from various worlds. He worked with a granite person who moved slowly but hit like a mountain falling down. Then he practiced with a windcatcher who could attack from above while flying. Each species had developed fighting styles based on their natural abilities. When Jake fought against Zephyrians like Vexka, he had to be extra careful. They had 4 arms instead of 2, and their shell-like skin was much harder than human flesh. But Jake had learned that being smaller and more flexible could be an advantage if he used his speed and intelligence correctly. "You fight like you are afraid to hurt me," Vexka said after their practice round ended. "How can you protect anyone if you will not use your full strength?" "I used enough strength to win the match," Jake replied, breathing hard from the exercise. "Sometimes that is all you need." Vexka clicked her mouthparts in frustration. "This is exactly what my uncle means. Humans always hold back when they should press forward. In real combat, your enemies will not give you a second chance." Jake wanted to explain that holding back did not mean being weak, but he knew Vexka would not understand. The Zephyrians had been raised to believe that maximum force was always the right answer. It was hard for them to see that sometimes the strongest choice was to use less force, not more. After training ended, Jake changed into his dress uniform and walked toward General Vextar's office. The hallways seemed longer than usual, and other cadets stopped talking when they saw him pass. Word had spread quickly that something important was about to happen. But instead of going to his office, General Vextar had left a message for Jake to meet him in the Academy's central courtyard. This was unusual. The courtyard was a large, open space in the middle of the station where cadets gathered for special ceremonies and announcements. It was also where disciplinary actions sometimes took place in front of other students. When Jake arrived at the courtyard, he saw that General Vextar was already there waiting. The general stood in the center of the space, his 4 arms crossed over his chest and his hard shell gleaming under the artificial lights. He was nearly 8 feet tall and looked like he could break a human in half without much effort. Other cadets had gathered around the edges of the courtyard. Jake could see Lisa and Crix in the crowd along with Vexka and many others. Everyone seemed to know that something important was about to happen, but no one was sure what it would be. "Cadet Morrison," General Vextar said in his deep, rumbling, "First, step forward." Jake walked to the center of the courtyard and stopped about 6 feet away from the general. He stood at attention with his back straight and his hands at his sides, the way all cadets were taught to do when speaking with superior officers. "Yesterday's simulation was instructive," General Vextar began. "It showed me something I have suspected for some time about human military thinking." Jake said nothing. He had learned that it was usually better to let superior officers say what they wanted to say before responding. "Your species has been part of the Galactic Alliance for 50 years, the general continued. "In that time, you have participated in joint training exercises, shared technology, and contributed to our common defense. But I believe there is a fundamental flaw in human military doctrine that makes you unsuitable for serious warfare." The courtyard was completely silent now. Even the normal background noise of the space station seemed to fade away as everyone focused on the general's words. "You are too concerned with minimizing casualties," Vextar said, his voice getting louder. "You spend too much time trying to find clever solutions instead of using direct force. You treat war like a puzzle to be solved rather than an enemy to be destroyed." Jake felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his expression neutral. "General, I respectfully disagree with that assessment. You may speak," Vextar replied, though his tone suggested he was not really interested in hearing Jake's opinion. "Sir, I believe that minimizing casualties while achieving mission objectives shows strategic thinking, not weakness. Throughout galactic history, the most successful military campaigns have been those that used intelligence and adaptability rather than just brute force. General Vextar's 4 eyes narrowed as he stared down at Jake. Give me an example. Jake thought quickly. The liberation of Kepler Station, sir. The Hive fleet had superior numbers and firepower, but the Alliance forces won by using the station's own defensive systems against the attackers. Instead of a direct assault that would have cost thousands of lives, the Alliance commanders found a way to achieve victory with minimal losses. That was not strategic thinking, Vextar replied angrily. That was luck and cowardice disguised as tactics. With respect, sir, I disagree. The commanders who planned that operation studied the station's layout for weeks. They understood how the defensive systems worked and figured out how to turn them to their advantage. That required intelligence, preparation, and courage. General Vextar's shell began to darken, which Jake knew was a sign of anger among Zephyrians. The general's voice rose as he spoke. This is exactly the problem with human thinking. You believe that being clever is the same as being strong. You think that avoiding direct confrontation makes you better soldiers. I think different situations require different approaches, Jake replied calmly. Sometimes direct force is the right answer. Sometimes it is not. In war, direct force is always the right answer, Vextar declared. The enemy does not care about your clever plans or your concern for casualties. They care only about victory, and they will use whatever force is necessary to achieve it. Jake could feel the tension in the courtyard increasing. The other cadets were watching with wide eyes, and several of the instructors had appeared at the edges of the crowd. This was no longer a simple discussion between a general and a cadet. It was becoming something much more serious. General, Jake said carefully, I understand your frustration with what you see as human weakness, but I think you are making an error in judgment. The words hung in the air like a challenge. General Vextar's 4 eyes widened with surprise and anger. No cadet had ever told him he was making an error in judgment, especially not a human cadet, who was barely old enough to be called an adult by his species' standards. What did you say? Vextar asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Jake knew he had crossed a line, but he also knew that some things needed to be said even when they were dangerous to say. Sir, you are assuming that humans choose diplomatic solutions because we are afraid of violence. You think our preference for minimizing casualties means we are not capable of fighting effectively when necessary. And you believe I am wrong about this? The general asked. Yes, sir, I do. The courtyard was so quiet that Jake could hear his own heartbeat. General Vextar stared at him for a long moment, and Jake could see the fury building in the alien's 4 eyes. The general's forearms uncrossed and hung at his sides, and his hands slowly formed into fists. You dare to question my understanding of military strategy? Vextar said, his voice shaking with rage. I have been fighting wars since before your species had discovered space travel. I have commanded fleets in battles that your people cannot even imagine. I respect your experience, sir, Jake replied. But experience in one type of warfare does not automatically make someone an expert in all types of warfare. That was the final insult that General Vextar could not ignore. The alien's massive body tensed like a spring being compressed, and Jake could see that something terrible was about to happen. Around the courtyard, other cadets stepped backward instinctively, sensing the danger in the air. You insolent little creature, Vextar snarled. You think your species is so superior to the rest of us? You think your cowardly tactics make you better warriors than those of us who have been fighting and dying while your people were still crawling in the mud? Before Jake could respond, General Vextar's primary right arm swung forward with tremendous force. The blow caught Jake across the left side of his face and sent him stumbling backward several steps. The sound of the impact echoed through the courtyard like a gunshot. Jake felt blood trickling from his split lip, and his left cheek was already beginning to swell. The silence in the courtyard stretched on for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few seconds. Jake stood there with blood on his lip, looking directly at General Vextar with those calm green eyes. He had not moved away from the general, had not raised his hands to defend himself and had not shown any sign of fear or anger. That was when the other cadets began to notice something strange happening. Crix was the first to feel it. His 3 eyes widened and his stone-like skin began to change color from its normal gray to a pale white. He took a step backward without knowing why, his body responding to instincts that were millions of years old. Lisa felt it too. The hair on her arm stood up and her heart began beating faster. She looked around at the other cadets and saw the same confused fear in their faces. Something was wrong, but none of them could explain what it was. Even the wind catchers hanging from their perches near the ceiling began to shift nervously, their wing arms fluttering as if they were preparing to fly away quickly. General Vextar was still standing in front of Jake, his forearms trembling slightly. The general's hard shell was dark with anger, but there was something else in his 4 eyes now, something that looked almost like fear, though that seemed impossible. Zephyrians were not afraid of anything, especially not small humans who barely came up to their chest. Jake wiped more blood from his lip and continued speaking in that same quiet, steady voice. General, I understand that you are frustrated with what you think is human weakness, but I need to tell you something important. As Jake spoke, the feeling in the courtyard grew stronger. It was not something that anyone could see or hear, but everyone could feel it pressing against their minds like a heavy weight. The granite people, who were normally afraid of nothing, found themselves wanting to hide behind something solid. The Aquarians, whose skin patterns usually showed their emotions clearly, had turned completely pale blue. You have been thinking about humans the wrong way, Jake continued. You see our preference for peaceful solutions and think it means we cannot fight. You see our concern for others and think it means we are weak, but you are making a very serious mistake. General Vexitar tried to speak, but no words came out. His throat felt dry, and his forearms were shaking more noticeably now. He wanted to step backward, but his legs would not obey him. Something primal in his brain was screaming warnings that he had never heard before. Jake took one small step forward. It was not threatening, not aggressive, just a single step. But the effect on everyone watching was immediate and terrifying. Several cadets stumbled backward as if they had been pushed. Others grabbed onto walls or railings to steady themselves. The thing is, Jake said, his voice still calm and measured, you have been studying human military tactics and finding them lacking. You think we are too careful, too concerned with saving lives, too willing to look for alternatives to violence, and you are right about all of those things. Vexka, who had been standing near the front of the crowd, made a small whimpering sound. Her hard shell was covered in sweat, and her forearms were wrapped around her body as if she was trying to protect herself from something she could not see. But what you do not understand, Jake continued, is why we are so careful. You think it is because we are afraid, or because we do not know how to fight properly. You could not be more wrong. As Jake spoke, images began flashing through the minds of everyone present. They were not seeing these images with their eyes, but somehow they were there in their thoughts anyway. Pictures of a blue and green world covered in cities and farms. Pictures of creatures that looked like Jake, but dressed in different clothing and carrying primitive weapons. We are careful, Jake said, because we know exactly what happens when we are not careful. The images in their minds became more intense. Battles between humans using simple weapons like swords and spears. The battles were brutal and endless, with thousands of fighters on each side. The humans in these visions fought with a intensity that none of the watching cadets had ever seen before. My species spent thousands of years fighting each other, Jake explained. Not fighting over resources or territory like most species do. Fighting over ideas, over beliefs, over principles that could not be measured or divided. We fought wars that lasted for decades because neither side would give up. General Vextar's legs began to shake. He tried to look away from Jake, but found that he could not move his eyes. The human was not using any kind of weapon or technology, but somehow he was more frightening than any enemy the general had ever faced in battle. The images continued. Humans fighting with metal weapons, then with gunpowder weapons, then with machines that could destroy entire cities. Each image showed the same thing. Humans who would not stop fighting no matter how hopeless their situation became. We learned to make war into an art form, Jake said. We studied it, perfected it, and practiced it on each other for centuries. We became very, very good at it. The courtyard was filled with the sound of heavy breathing and small whimpers of fear. Cadets from warrior species who had never known terror in their lives were experiencing it for the first time. Some of them were crying without understanding why. Then we discovered space travel, Jake continued. We met other species and learned that we were not alone in the universe. And we made a choice. Jake's voice became softer, but somehow that made it even more terrifying. We decided that we did not want to bring our gift for warfare to the stars. We chose to be peaceful, to be diplomatic, to look for solutions that did not involve violence. The images in their minds changed. Now, they saw humans working together with other species, building space stations, exploring new worlds, sharing technology and knowledge. But underneath those peaceful images was something else. The knowledge that all of this cooperation existed because humans had chosen to make it exist. You see our restraint and think it is weakness, Jake said. But restraint is only possible when you have something to restrain. A being who cannot fight is not peaceful. They are just harmless. We are not harmless, General. We are peaceful. There is a very big difference. General Vextar's knees began to buckle. The massive alien, who had commanded fleets and conquered worlds, was being brought to his knees by a human who had never raised his voice in anger. Every human doctrine, every human strategy, every human approach to conflict is built around one simple principle, Jake explained. We use the minimum force necessary to achieve our goals because we understand better than anyone else in this galaxy what maximum force actually looks like. The images became more intense. Nuclear weapons that could destroy continents, biological weapons that could wipe out entire species, chemical weapons that could make worlds uninhabitable for thousands of years. All of these things had been created by humans and used by humans against other humans. We do not seek to minimize casualties because we are weak, Jake said. We do it because we know exactly how effective we can be when we stop trying to minimize casualties. General Vextar fell to his knees with a loud crash. His hard shell struck the metal floor of the courtyard, and the sound echoed through the space like thunder. The general's forearms were wrapped around his body, and he was shaking like a leaf in a strong wind. Around the courtyard, other cadets were having similar reactions. Some had fallen to their knees like the general. Others were leaning against walls or holding on to each other for support. The wind catchers had all fled their perches and were huddled together in one corner, their wing arms covering their heads. Jake looked down at the fallen general with something that might have been pity in his green eyes. You wanted to know if humans are strong enough to be real warriors, General? The answer is yes. We are strong enough to be the most dangerous warriors this galaxy has ever seen. Jake knelt down next to the trembling Zephyrian and spoke in a voice that was almost gentle. But we are also strong enough to choose not to be. The revelation spread through the academy like wildfire over the next few hours. Cadets who had not been in the courtyard heard about what happened from those who were there. The story grew, with each telling, but the core truth remained the same. Humans were not the weak, naive species that everyone had thought they were. They were something far more dangerous than that. They were a species that had mastered warfare so completely that they had chosen to put it aside in favor of peace. Their gentleness was not a sign of weakness, but a sign of strength so complete that it no longer needed to prove itself. Jake helped General Vextar to his feet and walked with him to the medical center to make sure the general had not been injured when he fell. Along the way, other cadets and instructors stepped aside to let them pass, but not out of respect for the general's rank. They stepped aside out of a new understanding of what Jake Morrison represented. He was not just a human cadet trying to prove himself among the stars. He was a member of a species that had looked into the heart of darkness and chosen to walk toward the light instead. As they walked through the halls of Nexus Prime, Jake continued to be the same quiet, respectful cadet he had always been. But now everyone understood that his quietness came from strength, not weakness, and his respect for others came from a deep understanding of what happened when respect was abandoned. The days following the incident in the courtyard were unlike anything the Academy had ever experienced. Word of what happened spread not just through Nexus Prime, but to other military installations across the galaxy. Communication channels buzzed, with reports and questions that no one seemed able to answer completely. Jake continued his normal routine as if nothing had changed. He woke up early, attended classes, participated in training exercises, and studied in the evenings. But everything around him was different now. Other cadets looked at him with a mixture of respect, fear, and curiosity that had not been there before. General Vextar had spent 2 days in the medical center, not because of any physical injury, but because the doctors wanted to make sure he was mentally stable after what the medical reports called acute psychological stress response. When he returned to duty, he was a changed being. The first sign of this change came during a tactical planning session 3 days after the courtyard incident. Jake was presenting his analysis of a historical battle when General Vextar interrupted him. "Cadet Morrison," the general said, his voice much quieter than it had been before. "Please explain your reasoning for the flanking maneuver you suggested." Jake paused, surprised by the general's respectful tone. "Sir, the enemy had concentrated their forces in the center of their line. A direct assault would have resulted in heavy casualties on both sides. By attacking from multiple directions simultaneously, the Alliance forces could divide the enemy's attention and reduce overall losses." "And you believe this approach was superior to a concentrated assault?" Vextar asked. "In this specific situation, yes, sir. The goal was to capture the enemy position, not to destroy the enemy army. A concentrated assault might have achieved victory faster, but it would have cost more lives and damaged the strategic objective." General Vextar nodded slowly. "I see. And how would you modify this approach if the goal had been complete destruction of enemy forces?" Jake thought carefully before answering. "If the goal was total destruction, sir, then the flanking maneuver would still be effective, but the tactics within each attack group would change. Instead of focusing on capturing positions, each unit would focus on eliminating enemy soldiers and equipment." "Show me," Vextar said. Jake moved to the holographic display at the front of the classroom and began illustrating his modified battle plan. As he worked, he could feel the attention of every cadet in the room. They were not just learning about military tactics anymore. They were learning about how humans thought about warfare. "The key difference," Jake explained as he moved virtual units around the display, "is in the level of force applied at each contact point. For capture operations, you want to use just enough force to overcome resistance. For destruction operations, you want to use overwhelming force to eliminate the enemy's ability to continue fighting." General Vextar watched the display carefully. "And how do you determine the appropriate level of force for each situation?" "You start with your objective," Jake said. "Then you consider the cost of achieving that objective using different methods. The best approach is usually the one that achieves your goal with the least cost to your own forces and, when possible, to civilian populations." "When possible," Vextar repeated. "But not always." Jake met the general's eyes. "No, sir, not always. Sometimes the cost of restraint is higher than the cost of decisive action. But those decisions should never be made lightly or without considering all alternatives." The general was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked a question that surprised everyone in the room. "Cadet Morrison, in your opinion, what is the most important quality for a military commander?" Jake considered the question carefully. He knew that his answer would be heard not just by his classmates but by instructors and other officers throughout the academy. "Sir, I believe the most important quality is judgment. A commander needs to be able to assess complex situations quickly and choose the right response from many possible options." "More important than courage?" Vextar asked. "Courage is essential, sir, but courage without judgment can be dangerous. A brave commander who makes poor decisions can cause more harm than a careful commander who takes time to think." "More important than strength?" "Physical strength and firepower are tools, sir. Judgment determines how those tools are used. The strongest army in the galaxy can be defeated by a weaker force that uses better judgment." General Vextar stood up from his chair and walked to the front of the classroom. "Class dismissed," he said. "Cadet Morrison, please remain." After the other cadets filed out, Jake found himself alone with the general for the first time since the incident in the courtyard. Vextar looked different somehow. His posture was still military and professional, but there was something in his 4 eyes that had not been there before. "Cadet," the general began, "I owe you an apology." Jake was so surprised that he almost forgot to stand at attention. "Sir? For 50 years I have been teaching other species about warfare based on my experiences as a Zephyrian commander. I believed that my way of thinking about conflict was the only correct way. I was wrong." Jake remained silent, not sure how to respond to such an admission from a superior officer. "Your species joined the Galactic Alliance when I was already an established commander," Vextar continued. "I saw humans as newcomers who needed to learn from more experienced races. I never considered that you might have something to teach us." The general walked to the window and looked out at the stars beyond the space station. "I have spent the last 3 days reviewing human military history, the records that are available to Alliance commanders anyway. What I found was educational." Jake knew what records the general was referring to. The Alliance database contained detailed information about human conflicts, but most alien commanders never bothered to study them in depth. They assumed that wars fought with primitive weapons on a single planet could not teach them anything useful about modern galactic warfare. "Your species fought continuously for over 3,000 years, Vextar said without turning from the window. "Not occasional wars separated by periods of peace, but constant ongoing conflict somewhere on your world at all times." "Yes, sir," Jake replied quietly. "You developed strategies and tactics that my people never needed to consider, because we never faced enemies as adaptable and persistent as other humans. You learned to fight opponents who could think like you, plan like you, and adapt to your methods as quickly as you could adapt to theirs." The general turned back to face Jake. "Most species in the galaxy fight other species that think differently than they do. Humans learn to fight enemies who thought exactly like they did." "That changes everything," Jake nodded. "It means you cannot rely on your enemy making mistakes based on different thinking patterns. You have to assume they are as smart as you are, and plan accordingly." "Exactly," Vextar said. "And when you have spent thousands of years fighting enemies that smart, you develop a very sophisticated understanding of warfare. An understanding that my people, for all our experience, do not possess." The general moved closer to Jake, but this time there was no threat in his approach. "I want to ask you something, Cadet, and I want you to answer honestly. When you look at the tactical problems we study here at the Academy, how do they compare to the challenges your ancestors faced on Earth?" Jake thought about the question carefully. "Sir, most of the scenarios we study here involve conflicts between species with very different capabilities and thinking patterns. The solutions tend to focus on exploiting those differences. Human conflicts were different because both sides had similar capabilities and similar ways of thinking. The solutions had to be more creative." "More creative," Vexitar repeated. "Yes, I can see that now. When I first observed your approach to the simulation exercises, I thought you were being unnecessarily complicated. Now I understand that you were thinking about the problem in ways that my training never prepared me for." The general moved to his desk and sat down heavily in his chair. "Cadet Morrison, I have a confession to make. Yesterday, I contacted the Zephyrian High Command and recommended that human tactical doctrine be incorporated into our officer training programs." Jake's eyes widened in surprise. The Zephyrian military was one of the most traditional and conservative in the galaxy. For them to consider changing their methods based on human ideas was almost unthinkable. "I also sent a formal apology to the human representative on the Alliance Military Council," Vexitar continued. "I explained that my previous reports about human military capabilities had been based on incomplete understanding and personal prejudice." "Sir, you did not need to do that," Jake said. "Yes, I did," the general replied firmly. "For 50 years, humans have been underestimated and underutilized in Alliance military planning. How many conflicts could have been resolved more efficiently if we had listened to human perspectives from the beginning? How many lives could have been saved?" Jake remained silent. These were questions that had occurred to him many times during his years at the Academy, but he had never expected to hear them from a Zephyrian general. 6 months later, Jake Morrison stood in the graduation hall of Nexus Prime. wearing the dark blue uniform of a newly commissioned Alliance officer. Around him, hundreds of other cadets from dozens of worlds were also preparing to receive their assignments and begin their careers serving the galaxy. The months following the incident in the courtyard had brought changes that no one could have predicted. News of what happened had spread far beyond the academy, reaching military commanders, political leaders, and civilian populations across Alliance space. The story had grown and changed with each telling, but the core message remained the same. Humans were not what they appeared to be. Jake looked around the graduation hall and saw many familiar faces. Lisa was there, having earned the highest scores in pilot training. Crick stood nearby, his stone-like skin showing the pale green color that meant happiness among his people. Even Vexka was present, though she looked at Jake with an expression that was hard to read. The ceremony began with speeches from Alliance officials and Academy instructors. Admiral Chen, a human who served as the Academy's commanding officer, spoke about the importance of cooperation between species and the challenges that lay ahead in exploring new regions of space. Then General Vextar stepped up to the speaking platform. His appearance had changed over the past 6 months. He still wore his military uniform and carried himself with the same professional bearing, but there was something different in his manner. He seemed more thoughtful, more careful with his words. "Fellow graduates," the general began, "today marks the end of your training and the beginning of your service to the Alliance. You have learned to work together despite coming from worlds with different environments, different cultures, and different ways of thinking about the universe." Jake listened carefully as Vextar continued his speech. The general's words were more thoughtful than his old speeches, which had focused mainly on discipline and strength. "During your time here, you have discovered that diversity is not a weakness to be overcome, but a strength to be embraced. Each species brings unique perspectives and abilities that make our alliance stronger than any single world could be alone." The general paused and looked directly at Jake. "Some of you have taught the rest of us lessons that we did not expect to learn. You have shown us that our assumptions about strength, courage, and leadership were incomplete. For this, we are grateful." After the speeches ended, individual cadets received their assignments. Jake was assigned to the Alliance ship New Horizon, an exploration vessel with a mixed crew representing 23 different species. The ship's mission was to explore the Outer Rim territories and establish contact with new civilizations. As Jake accepted his assignment datapad from Admiral Chen, the human officer spoke quietly to him. "Lieutenant Morrison, your actions here have opened doors that were closed for 50 years. The Alliance High Council has taken note of human military philosophy, and there are plans to incorporate these ideas into our strategic planning. You should be proud of what you have accomplished." "Thank you, sir," Jake replied. "I was just trying to do my best as a cadet." Admiral Chen smiled. "Sometimes doing your best changes everything." After the ceremony, Jake walked through the academy, one last time before leaving for his new assignment. The halls looked the same as they had 3 years ago when he first arrived, but everything felt different now. Other cadets nodded respectfully as he passed, and instructors who had once seemed distant now treated him as a colleague rather than just a student. He found General Vextar in the Tactical Simulation Center, reviewing training scenarios with a group of new instructors. The general looked up when Jake entered and dismissed the others so they could speak privately. "Lieutenant Morrison," Vextar said, "I wanted to thank you again before you left for your new assignment. General, you have already thanked me several times. There is no need to continue doing so." Vextar's 4 eyes showed something that might have been amusement. "You are wrong about that. What you did here was more important than just teaching one old general that his ideas were incomplete. You changed how the entire Alliance thinks about human capabilities." Jake nodded but said nothing. He had heard similar statements from other officers over the past few months, but he still found it hard to believe that one conversation in a courtyard could have such far-reaching effects. "The Alliance High Council has authorized the creation of new mixed-species tactical units," Vextar continued. "These units will combine human strategic thinking with the natural abilities of other species. Early simulations suggest they will be far more effective than our current single-species military formations. That sounds like a positive development, sir. It is more than positive, Lieutenant. It is revolutionary. For the first time since the Alliance was formed, we are truly using the best capabilities of all our member species instead of just trying to make everyone fit into the same military structure. The General moved to the simulation controls and activated a holographic display showing various ship formations. Your approach to problem solving has been incorporated into our standard tactical training. New cadets now learn to consider multiple solutions to every challenge instead of just looking for the most direct approach. Jake studied the formations on the display. They were more complex than traditional Alliance tactics, but he could see how they would be more effective in situations requiring careful coordination between different types of ships and crews. There is something else, Vextar said. The Zephyrian High Command has requested permission to send a group of our officers to Earth for extended training in human military history and philosophy. They want to understand how your species developed such sophisticated approaches to warfare. This surprised Jake more than anything else he had heard. The Zephyrians were known for their pride in their own military traditions. For them to ask to learn from humans was almost unthinkable. They approved the request, Jake asked. Not only approved it, but expanded it. Representatives from 12 different species will be participating in the exchange program. Your species will finally have the opportunity to share your knowledge with the rest of the Alliance in a formal setting. Jake felt a mix of pride and responsibility. I hope they find the exchange useful. I am sure they will, Vextar replied. But I want you to understand something important, Lieutenant. The changes that are happening now are not just because of what you said in that courtyard 6 months ago. They are happening because of how you said it. Jake looked confused, so the General continued. You could have responded to my strike with anger or violence. Most species would have. Instead, you chose to educate rather than retaliate. You showed strength through restraint, exactly as you had been trying to explain to me with words. Was just trying to make you understand that humans are not weak, Jake said, and you succeeded. But more than that, you showed the entire Academy what true strength looks like. Not the ability to hurt others, but the wisdom to know when hurting others is necessary and when it is not. General Vextar deactivated the holographic display and turned to face Jake directly. Lieutenant, you are going to encounter many new species during your mission on the New Horizon. Some of them will underestimate humans just as I did. When that happens, remember that your greatest weapon is not your knowledge of warfare, but your commitment to using that knowledge responsibly. Jake saluted the General, a gesture that Vextar returned with obvious respect. I will remember, sir. Thank you for everything you have taught me. Thank you for everything you taught me, the General replied. Jake left the Academy that afternoon, aboard a transport ship bound for the orbital station where the New Horizon was docked. As Nexus Prime grew smaller in the viewport, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this point. 3 years ago, he had arrived at the Academy hoping to prove that humans could be useful members of the Alliance military. He had expected to face challenges and prejudice from other species who saw humans as weak or naive. What he had not expected was to discover that the greatest challenge would be helping others understand that human approaches to conflict were different, not inferior. The New Horizon was an impressive ship, designed for long-range exploration, and equipped with the most advanced technology the Alliance could provide. Jake's quarters were small, but comfortable, with a viewport that showed the stars streaming past as the ship traveled toward its first destination. His new captain was Commander Sarah Williams, a human officer with 15 years of experience in Alliance service. She welcomed Jake aboard and introduced him to the other senior officers, who came from 8 different species. Each of them had heard about the incident at the Academy, and Jake could see both curiosity and respect in their expressions. Lieutenant Morrison, Captain Williams said as they stood on the ship's bridge, your reputation precedes you. I hope you are prepared for the responsibility that comes with it. I will do my best to serve the ship and the Alliance, Captain, Jake replied. I know you will. But remember that you are not just representing yourself or even just humanity. You are representing the idea that different approaches to problem solving can work together to create something stronger than any single approach alone.